My brother made me invisible for 34 years and stole everything from me, but when he tried to seduce my fiancée, I destroyed him at my own wedding and left him with no wife, no business, and no family. I'm 34 years old. I work in logistics for a distribution company, and I never thought I'd say this, but my wedding day was also the day I destroyed my brother in front of our entire family. And you know what? I don't regret it one bit, but for you to understand why I did what I did, I have to take you back years, to when we were kids, and I learned what it meant to be invisible in your own home. James is 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he was the center of the family universe. I'm not exaggerating when I say everything revolved around him. Anything James did was amazing, revolutionary, worthy of celebration. He'd get a B in school and my parents would organize a special dinner. I'd get an A and it was like, "Oh, that's nice, son. Keep it up." James played soccer on Saturdays and the whole family would go watch him, screaming and clapping like it was the World Cup final. I played guitar in the school band, and my parents always had some excuse not to come to the concerts, that they were tired, that they had other things to do. The thing is, from a very young age, I understood what my place was in that family, and that place was basically in the shadows, applauding my brother's achievements while mine went unnoticed. What fucked me up the most, and sorry for the language, but it's the only way to describe it, was how my parents justified everything. James needed this or that because he had potential, because he was going to do great things, because he was special. When he turned 16, they bought him a used BMW. It wasn't new, but it was a damn BMW. Black, immaculate, and I remember perfectly the happiness on my father's face when he handed him the keys. 3 years later, when I turned 16, you know what they gave me? My father's old Ford, a 2003 that already had like 200,000 miles on it and made a weird noise every time you started it. My mother told me, "You should be grateful. We didn't have a car at your age," and I just nodded, because by that point I'd learned that complaining didn't do any good. College was more of the same, but worse. James went to an expensive business school, one of those private ones where tuition costs the same as a new car, and my parents paid for everything, plus his apartment, plus a generous allowance so he could focus on studying and wouldn't have to work. I wanted to study business administration too. I liked the logistics and operations stuff, but when it came time to talk about universities, my father sat me down and said, "Look, your brother is already costing us a lot. You're going to have to look for something more affordable." So I ended up at a public university, which wasn't bad actually, but I worked nights in a warehouse, unloading trucks to pay my expenses because my parents' help was minimal. James graduated in 4 years with honors, and there was a giant party with like 100 guests. I graduated in 5 years because working and studying at the same time isn't easy, and the celebration was a dinner at the house, just family, and they basically spent the whole time talking about how James was already planning to open his first restaurant. Oh yeah, James's restaurants. That's another story that makes my blood boil every time I remember it. Turns out, when James was like 26, he met Caroline at some social event, a girl from a family with a lot of money. Like her father owned several distribution companies and had contacts everywhere. Caroline was pretty, educated, quiet, and honestly, I always liked her. But James saw her, and I think more than falling in love, he saw an opportunity. They got married a year after meeting. Giant wedding at a 5-star hotel, honeymoon in Europe, the whole package. And guess what happened 6 months after the wedding? Caroline's dad lent James I don't know how many thousands of dollars to open his first restaurant, plus gave him distribution contracts with preferential prices. The restaurant was a success. James opened a second one 2 years later. And suddenly my brother was the successful entrepreneur of the family. My parents' pride. The one who had triumphed. Meanwhile, I was working at my logistics company. Had been moving up little by little. It wasn't anything spectacular, but I was making good money, and I liked my job. My parents basically never asked about it. Family gatherings were James talking about his restaurants, his expansion plans, the chefs he'd hired, and everyone listening fascinated. If I mentioned something about my work, it was like, "Oh, that's nice," and they'd change the subject back to James. I spent years, literally years, feeling like an extra in my own family, like my only function was to be there to fill space and applaud my brother's achievements. But then I met Julia, and she changed everything. It was at a networking event for my company like 4 years ago. I was there kind of bored, drinking bad coffee and trying not to look too out of place, when she came up and started talking to me. Julia's a lawyer, works in corporate law, and she's one of those people who makes you feel interesting when you talk to them. You know what I mean? She asked me about my work and really listened to my answers. It wasn't the typical superficial conversation at those events. We talked for like an hour that night, and I asked for her number before leaving. We started dating, and the truth is that with Julia, I felt seen for the first time in my life. She valued what I did, asked me about my projects, celebrated my small achievements, and when I told her about my family and James, she got angry on my behalf in a way no one ever had. She'd tell me things like, "That's not right, you deserve respect," and I felt like finally someone understood me. I proposed after a year of dating, at a nice but not ostentatious restaurant, nothing compared to James's proposal to Caroline, which according to the photos, had been on a private beach at sunset, but Julia loved it. We organized a small engagement party at her parents' house a few weeks later, and we invited my family, obviously. And that's where it all started. Though at the time, I didn't see it coming at all. James arrived with Caroline at the party and was weird all night, like he was there but he wasn't, and I noticed because suddenly he started looking for excuses to talk to Julia. Like, "Congratulations, you look really good. Tell me what you do." Julia mentioned it to me after the party. She said, "Your brother is very intense, huh?" And I laughed because, well, James had always been like that. Center of attention, needed everyone to be aware of him, but I didn't think much of it. But turns out I should have because James didn't stop there. Like 2 weeks after the party, he called me and said he wanted to meet with me to talk about a business matter. We met at a coffee shop and he told me he was thinking about expanding his restaurants and needed corporate legal advice, and that he'd thought about hiring the firm where Julia worked. I asked him why he didn't use the firm he already had, and he gave me a kind of weird excuse about wanting a second opinion, about having heard that Julia's firm was very good. At that moment I thought, well, if it helps her professionally, that's fine. And I gave him the contact. What I didn't know was that was just an excuse to have access to her. Julia told me later, when everything exploded, that James started calling her constantly, supposedly about contract issues, but always trying to extend the conversations to personal topics. Like, how were the wedding plans going? Was she sure about what she wanted? Didn't she think they were rushing things? She handled it professionally at first, thinking it was just his way of being, but the calls became more frequent and weirder, and then the messages started. Text messages at 11 at night, like, "Hi, Julia, I was thinking about what we talked about today, or I saw you at the coffee shop this morning. You looked really good in that blue dress." She showed them to me and I felt my blood boiling. But Julia told me she wanted to handle it right, that she didn't want to cause problems in my family, and I accepted, even though inside I wanted to break my brother's face. But James didn't stop, obviously. One day, Julia left her office, and he was waiting for her in the parking lot. He told her they needed to talk privately about the contract, and she agreed because she was still being professional despite everything. They sat in her car, and James basically laid it all out. That she was too smart for me, that I was just an average guy with an average job, that she deserved someone who was at her level, someone like him. He told her he understood she was engaged to me, but that was a mistake, that over time she'd realize it. Julia told me she stayed quiet for a few seconds, processing what she'd just heard, and then asked him, "Are you insinuating what I think you're insinuating?" And James, the bastard, told her yes, that he was interested in her, that he'd felt a connection since the engagement party, that Caroline and him weren't doing well, total lie, and that if Julia gave him a chance, he'd leave everything for her. This is where Julia proved why she's the smartest person I know. She didn't argue with him, didn't yell at him, none of that. She told him she needed time to think, that it was a complicated situation, and James left the parking lot thinking he'd planted the seed of doubt. What he didn't know was that Julia had recorded the entire conversation with her phone from the moment James started talking. That same night, Julia came to our house and showed me everything, the messages, the calls, the parking lot recording, and I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing and hearing. There was my brother, the family's golden boy, trying to steal my girlfriend, telling her I wasn't enough for her, basically doing exactly what he'd done his whole life, taking what he wanted, regardless of who he hurt. Julia asked me what I wanted to do, and I told her the truth. I want to destroy him. It sounds horrible put that way. I know, but it had been 30-something years of being less than James, of being ignored, kind of watching him get everything while I had to work twice as hard for half the recognition, and now he was trying to take the only thing that really mattered, the only person who had made me feel valuable. So Julia and I sat down and planned everything. We continued as if nothing had happened. Julia kept responding to James's messages, but in a neutral, professional way, not giving him false hope, but also not cutting him off completely. James thought his plan was working, that Julia was considering his proposal. Like 3 months passed from the parking lot incident to our wedding, and in that time James kept sending Julia messages, increasingly desperate. One day he wrote something like, "I can't stop thinking about you. I think you're the person I should have always known." Another day he sent her, "If you change your mind about my brother, I'll be here waiting for you." Everything was saved, everything documented. The guy dug his own grave with every message, every call, every word he said, thinking he was conquering Julia, when in reality he was building the case against himself. The wedding day arrived, a Saturday in June. Perfect weather. The place looked amazing. Julia was beautiful. And I was honestly happy, but also nervous about what I knew was going to happen. James was my best man. Because, well, despite everything, he was my brother, and my parents would have made a scene if I hadn't included him in the wedding that way. The ceremony was beautiful. No problems. Everything went perfectly. And we got to the reception. We ate, danced, the guests were happy, everything very normal. And then came the time for speeches. My father-in-law spoke first, said nice things about Julia and our relationship. Then Julia's maid of honor spoke, her best friend from college. And finally it was James's turn, the best man. James stood up with his champagne glass, smiling like nothing was wrong, and started his speech. He talked about growing up with me, about how we were so different but still brothers, about how he was happy to see me find love. All very nice, very emotional. People were there with their glasses listening. And just when James was in the middle of his speech, the screens we'd installed supposedly to show photos of Julia and me from when we were kids suddenly changed. And there, projected for all 200 guests to see, appeared James's first message to Julia. "Hi, Julia. I was thinking about what we talked about today. Message from 11 at night." James went silent immediately, looking at the screen with a pale face. And before he could react, the next message appeared. "I saw you at the coffee shop this morning. You looked really good in that blue dress." Then another, and another, and another. Each message more inappropriate than the last, and the entire room was in absolute silence watching the screens. My parents were sitting there with their mouths open. Caroline was crying. The guests were murmuring among themselves. And James just kept repeating, "No, no, no, this isn't happening." But it was happening, and the best part hadn't arrived yet. After the messages, the parking lot video started playing, with clear, perfect audio. And there was James, in HD for everyone to see, telling my fiancée that I was just an average guy with an average job, that she deserved something better, that he was interested in her and would leave everything for her. The video lasted like 5 minutes, and every second was a delicious agony to watch. James tried to leave the room, but several of my friends, who already knew what was going to happen, were blocking the exits. He had to stand there, watching his entire perfect image get destroyed in front of family, friends, business partners, everyone. When the video ended, Julia stood up and took the microphone. She said, with impressive calm, "I wanted everyone to know the type of person James is, the type of brother who tried to sabotage his own younger brother's happiness, the same brother who has lived his whole life in his shadow." And having said that, she gave me the microphone. I took it, looked at James, and said just one thing. 34 years, I waited for someone in this family to see me, and it had to be you, trying to take the only good thing in my life, who showed me that I was never the problem. The problem was always you. Caroline stood up from the table, took off her wedding ring right there, and threw it at James's face. Caroline's father, who was sitting at the main table with us, also stood up and told James something I didn't fully catch, but that ended with the words, "My office on Monday. We're going to terminate all contracts." My parents tried to talk to James. My mother was crying, saying there had to be an explanation, and my father just looked at James with an expression I'd never seen on him, like disappointment mixed with disgust. James finally ran out of the room. Caroline went after him, but only to yell more things at him. And the rest of the reception was basically everyone processing what they'd just seen. Julia and I left the room like an hour later, when things calmed down a bit, and we went to the hotel suite we had reserved for the wedding night. We were tired, emotionally drained, but we also felt like a strange relief, you know? Like finally the world knew the truth about James, about me, about everything. Julia hugged me that night and told me, "No one's going to make you invisible again. I'll make sure of that." And honestly, I believed her. What happened after was fast. Caroline filed for divorce that same week, and her lawyer made it clear it was going to be a complicated process for James because Caroline was furious. Caroline's father kept his word and terminated all distribution contracts with James's restaurants, and without those preferential contracts, the restaurants started losing money almost immediately. James tried calling me like 1,000 times in the days following the wedding, voicemails saying we needed to talk, that it had all been a misunderstanding, that I'd ruined his life. I blocked him after the 5th message because, honestly, I had nothing to say to him. My parents also called, and that conversation was harder. My mother was crying, saying, how could I humiliate my brother like that in public, that it had been cruel, that family matters are handled privately. My father was quieter but still said I'd crossed the line. I told them, as calmly as I could, that you guys spent 34 years putting me in second place, ignoring my achievements, financing James's life while I worked nights to pay for my university, and when he finally crosses an unforgivable line, your reaction is to protect him? Seriously? My mother said that wasn't true, that they loved us both equally, and I just laughed because it was so obviously false it wasn't worth arguing about. I told them that if they wanted to have a relationship with me, they were going to have to accept that James had done something unforgivable and that I wasn't going to pretend it didn't happen just to keep family peace. I hung up and didn't talk to them for like 3 months. James's restaurants ended up going bankrupt because turns out without Caroline's father's support and without Caroline managing the household finances, James wasn't as good a businessman as everyone thought. He had to sell both restaurants at a loss, and from what I heard, he ended up moving to another city to start over, away from all the people who saw him fall. I don't know exactly where he is now. It's been like 2 years since the wedding, and I haven't spoken to him once. Caroline got remarried a few months ago to a guy she met at work, an accountant who, from what they told me, is super quiet and treats her well, and I'm honestly happy for her. She was never a bad person, just had the bad luck of falling in love with my brother. My parents eventually started calling again, and this time the conversation was different. My father admitted that maybe, just maybe, they had favored James more than they should have. It wasn't a complete apology, but coming from my father it was something. My mother still thinks I was too hard on James, but at least she doesn't constantly reproach me for it anymore. Now when we go visit them, which is like once every 2 months or so, they ask me about my work, about Julia, about our plans, things they never asked about before. It's weird, after so many years of being ignored, to suddenly have their attention, but I guess it's a start. Julia and I are doing well, better than well, actually. We bought a house last year. Nothing ostentatious, but it's ours and we love it. She's still working at her firm and is considering becoming a partner, which would be amazing. I got a promotion at my company a few months ago. Now I'm regional operations manager, and I finally feel like my work is valued and recognized. And like 3 weeks ago, we found out Julia's pregnant. We're expecting our first child next year. And honestly, I never thought I could feel so happy and so scared at the same time. Sometimes I think about what happened at the wedding and wonder if I crossed the line, if there was another way to handle all that. But then I remember all those years feeling invisible, all the times my achievements were ignored while James's were celebrated, and especially, I remember James in that parking lot telling Julia I wasn't enough for her. And you know what? I don't regret it. Maybe it was cruel to do it so publicly. Maybe I destroyed my brother in front of everyone. But after a lifetime of being stepped on by him, of being treated like I didn't matter, Finally, someone had to put him in his place. And turns out that someone had to be me. With the help of the woman who really sees me, who really values me, who chose me despite everything James tried. Last week, Julia found an old photo of me, from when I was like 8 years old, at a school recital playing guitar. I'm there on stage, with a guitar that was too big for me. And in the background of the photo, you can see the auditorium half empty because my parents didn't go. Julia saw it and told me, "Our child is never going to feel like that, never going to feel like they have to compete for our attention or our love." And I know it's true, because we both know what it feels like not to be the priority, and we're going to do everything differently. I guess in the end, something good came out of all this. I learned exactly what type of father I don't want to be.